What is up, everybody? It is time once again for a video, and I gotta say, I know I'm over a decade late to this party, and I'm sure the libertarians out there have seen this topic tackled, but I thought I'd take a crack at it after stumbling upon it again recently. For those of you who aren't aware, Jon Stewart several years ago asked 19 questions to libertarians. And while Jon Stewart hasn't really been relevant in quite some time, these questions are. I also feel the need before we start to add that I am not just a libertarian, I am an anarcho-capitalist, which I believe to be the logical conclusion of libertarianism. I mention this because plenty of libertarians believe in a small, minarchist-style government and would answer some of these questions a bit differently than I would. ANCAPs, however, believe in the total abolition of the state. But without further delay, let's jump in. Question number 1. Is government the antithesis of liberty? Well, technically, oppression and subjugation are the antithesis of liberty, but government is the means of institutionalizing that oppression and subjugation. So government is the monopoly of coercion and violence in a geographic region. So in short, yes, government is inherently in opposition to liberty. Number 2, one of the things that enhances freedoms are roads. Infrastructure enhances freedom. A social safety net enhances freedom. Now here's where a lot of libertarians wouldn't miss a beat to just dunk on Stewart and slap a roads meme on the screen, but as fun as that is, let's address this because this is a very common question about the roads. When I hear this, I always like to point out how complex and, to a layman like me, incomprehensible the inner workings of automobile mechanics are. I mean, you pop the hood on your car, I can't tell you half the shit that's going on in there. You have sensors, you get an engine, you got radiators, hoses, batteries, and this just goes into what makes the vehicle run. Then you have all the interior and exterior cosmetic features. You have the tires, sound systems, Bluetooth, reclining seats that'll warm up on command in some of these cars, keyless entry, air conditioning, all the cool stuff that goes on inside cars and trucks. Then you realize that these things are mass produced by multiple manufacturers all across the world, and they're shipped all across the world, and they're available to everybody, whether they are brand new or used, at a relatively affordable sum. Everybody has a car. Normally everybody has at least one car in America. Now the roads question asks us to believe that the market can accomplish all of those feats, all of those things. But if it weren't for a coercive monopoly seizing your money, we could not possibly have flat surfaces with paint on them to drive these things around on. So you have these incredible machines and all this ingenuity that goes into it, but we need the government to put guns in people's heads and say, hey, we need flat surfaces with paint, so give me your money. Think on that for a moment, and forget that we have decades of libertarian thought on how these services can be relatively easily achieved by the free market. That is, if anyone seriously asking this question can be bothered to look for the answer. To me, the even darker and much more sinister implication of this question, though, is that your freedom to not have a gun to your head, to not be opposed upon by a coercive monopoly called the state, that basic freedom of yours and mine has to be stifled or undermined because Jon Stewart and other statists can't imagine how certain things would work if they were actually free. This is quite literally akin to arguing that without the slaves, who's going to pick all this cotton? Perhaps again, if you don't bother to look at the dozens of books and half a century's worth at least of writings and lectures from libertarians like Murray Rothbard, Stefan Molyneux, Walter Block, and others, perhaps we don't know exactly how all these things will be accomplished in a free world. But we have to begin the conversation with morality. It's wrong to take people's things without their consent. Roads are currently mostly funded via taxation, which is taking someone's money without their consent. Theft is wrong if I do it, if Jon Stewart does it, or when I and Jon Stewart vote for someone else to do it. That's consistent morality. Okay, I really don't understand this question, but number 3, what should we do with the losers that are picked by the free market? I don't understand because if a service provider is consistently picked by the free market, meaning consumers who are consistently rewarding them with money in exchange for their services, then they're not losers by definition. I'm not really sure what he means by this. Now, if he just simply means the businesses and people who are beaten out by their competition, they have a lot of options. They can find new ways to innovate and earn money that way. They can find better products to provide, find ways to lower costs, etc. If these are workers for those businesses, they can take their labor and profit from it elsewhere. They can acquire new skills, they can better their education, that will give them a competitive edge in the future to earn more money. There are a lot of options. The bottom line here is just that coercion is not acceptable if anybody does it. Everything has to be voluntary. All interactions, all agreements, all trades, all transactions just have to be voluntary. Number 4, do we live in a society or don't we? Are we a collective? Everybody's success is predicated on the hard work of all of us. Nobody gets there on their own. Why should it be that people who lose are hung out to dry? For a group of people that don't believe in evolution, it's awfully Darwinian. Oh boy. We'll get to the Darwinian part here at the end, but first, do we live in a society? I would say we clearly live in a society as far as I understand the definition. We are a lot of people who benefit from the work, innovation, commerce, etc. So if that's the definition of society, then yes, we do live in a society. And we are a collective in the sense that we are, again, a group of people largely working together in cooperation. But that in and of itself can be misleading. We're not working in a authoritative cooperation with each other. We're working in a decentralized, voluntary, monetarily incentivized mutual cooperation with each other. There's a big distinction. And I think that's the beauty of capitalism. And you could watch Milton Friedman's pencil example for a better explanation as to why the price system in free markets is the most financially successful system ever devised, and how it not only leads to more wealth and prosperity, it leads to more harmony and mutual understanding between people than the other systems do. And to say nobody gets there on their own is true again in a sense, but that doesn't mean we, nor any group of we's, is entitled to violate the rights of individuals in the system. Rights begin with the individual. That's why this matters. And again, this includes seizing a portion of their earnings. And I don't know who says people should be hung out to dry if they lose. I've never met a libertarian who believes that. I think that's a straw man. I strongly support systems that help people who struggle in all areas of life. I just don't believe it's acceptable to violate one man's right for any reason, even if it is to render aid to another man. All human interactions should be voluntary and not coercive. Oh, and also the idea that libertarians don't believe in evolution is just another silly straw man. This sounds like Bush-era John Stewart taking on conservatives. This doesn't sound like an actual argument against libertarianism. I'm sure there are some libertarians out there who don't believe in evolution. I certainly do believe in evolution. Every libertarian I ever hear talk acknowledges evolution whenever that topic comes up. Even if you didn't, it's totally unrelated to the concept of libertarianism. Number 5, in a representative democracy, we are the government. We have work to do, and we have a business to run, and we have children to raise. We elect you as our representatives to look after our interests within a democratic system. Okay, John, if you are an adult who actually believes this bullshit, then it's no wonder you're asking some of these questions. You are not the government. We are not the government. The government consists of a relatively tiny group of individuals who lord over the vast majority, who are propagandized from birth to grant legitimacy to an authoritarian abomination called government. In short, government is a scam. It's a con job on a level unthinkable outside of organized religion. I've done videos on why democracy is just another form of authoritarianism, so I'm not going to go too hard in the paint here, but I'll just finish this by saying that this is not even a question, it's just another regurgitation of state propaganda. Number 6, is government inherently evil? Well, if government is the antithesis of liberty as we discussed earlier, then I would say yes, it is inherently evil. Government is not just a tiny minority of people relative to the population of the nation it governs, it's a contradiction in societal morality. It's a group of people wielding a coercive monopoly power that no other individual or group of individuals in society can rightly possess themselves. All around and necessarily, the nature of government is that of a monopoly power that subsists through inherently violent, parasitic, and invasive means. It cannot exist without these characteristics, and that necessitates its branding as being inherently evil. Basically, government is Sauron's ring from Lord of the Rings. It is a power that cannot be controlled by people, and it needs to be thrown in the fires of Mount Doom. Number 7, sometimes to protect the greater liberty, you have to do things like form an army or gather a group together to build a wall or levee. Jon Stewart supports government building walls now. This is definitely pre-Trump era, though. But seriously, look, I've done videos and other libertarian thinkers have done forums, blogs, and speeches, and written books on how we can have defensive services in a free market. Defense service, building walls and levees, all of this can be done voluntarily by providers of these services without robbing people, without installing a violent monopoly to lord over us. There is nothing unique about these topics that necessitates coercion or robbery. Number 8. As soon as you've built an army, you've now said the government isn't always inherently evil because we need it to help us sometimes. So now, it's like that old joke, would you sleep with me for $1 million? How about $1? Who do you think I am? We already decided who you are, now we're just negotiating. But I don't support a government military program because I don't support government programs or institutions at all. Again, see my videos on defense in my Stateless Solutions series. Number 9, you say government which governs least governs best. But that was the Articles of Confederation. We tried that for 8 years, it didn't work, and went to the Constitution. The U.S. Constitution was established in a literal coup because the men in power weren't getting what they wanted from the Articles of Confederation. I say a better system than both the Articles of Confederation and the U.S. Constitution is actual freedom. Number 10, you give money to the IRS because you think they're going to hire a bunch of people. That if your house catches on fire, will come there with water. No, I don't give money to the IRS. My taxes are forcefully seized from my earnings. I would rather set it on fire than give it to the IRS, who's going to waste most of it in bureaucracy and then use the rest on things I would never voluntarily support, like bombing campaigns in third world countries with the army you earlier justified. And I don't know how much federal funds go to fire departments. I think most of that is actually done locally through other tax streams. But again, these services can easily be contracted by individuals, HOAs, apartment complexes, businesses, private organizations, insurance companies, etc. I have videos on all that as well. Again, no coercion necessary. You do not have to point guns at people and threaten them with years in a cage to put out fires. Number 11, why is it that libertarians trust a corporation in certain matters more than they trust representatives that are accountable to voters? The idea that I would give up my liberty to an insurance company as opposed to my representative seems insane. Well, for starters, corporations as we know them now could not exist in a voluntarist society. Corporations today have legal protections granted to them by government that shields them from liability. As for businesses in general, they're actually significantly more accountable than politicians. You don't vote for Walmart once every 4 years. You vote every time you consume their products or you don't consume their products. As a result of being voluntarily funded, that is the natural incentive for Walmart and other businesses to actually care about what their customers want. And of course, this isn't perfect. It's just better. If you don't like Walmart or how it operates, you get to choose another business to shop at. Now try that with a government or political representation. Number 12, why is it that with competition, we have such difficulty with our healthcare system? And there are choices within the educational system. Okay, I did a video on American healthcare and when it started becoming expensive, why it's expensive, and how we can lower the costs of the care. So to make this response brief, you can check out that other video for all that, but to make this response brief, since the mid-1960s especially, government has had an extremely heavy hand in the regulation of U.S. healthcare. From certificate of need laws to government-granted monopolies for pharmaceutical companies, to the cost of Medicare and Medicaid not being negotiated, thus prices are then passed down to private parties, to the uninsured being treated at the expense of private parties, government incentivized employer-based health care, a government monopoly on approving new drugs, laws banning the importation of drugs already available in other major countries, a government-backed monopoly on approving new doctors, lack of price transparency, taxes on medical equipment, regulations strangling out competition, and healthcare plans being banned. Here's a good question. Why is it that only in the areas of the market that government has such a heavy hand that we see these issues with prices outpacing inflation? We don't see this in computers or cell phones, tablets, clothes, jewelry, entertainment, food, movies, or any of the other areas of the market where the government isn't so prevalent. It's conveniently in healthcare, education, and housing, where the government has such high levels of involvement, that we see prices going through the goddamn roof. As for choices in education, that's just a joke. If a private business had a hold anything like the government currently has on education, you guys would be demanding that it be broken up under antitrust laws. This is just another area where statists like John aren't demanding universality in their societal morality, because they've been duped into thinking that this machine called government works for them. Government owns education, and it's owned it for over a century in the United States. It also guarantees payment of college loans, which is why college expenses have gone through the roof. Imagine a world where the government wasn't backing these loans. How hard would a banker laugh at a 19-year-old kid with no job history or credit who wanted a $150,000 loan to go to university? I rest my case. Number 13, would you go back to 1890? Sure. Would I want to live there? No, but that isn't because we had a small government with no income taxes. It's because, look, dude, I'm an entitled American who's used to a 21st century standard of living. I live in Texas. I love having air conditioning. I wouldn't have that in 1890. Here's what I think. I think we could bring back the good things from older times without bringing back all the negatives. Nobody wants to go live in, like, poverty and squalor. But I know John Stewart would say, well, the reason we don't have the poverty and squalor now is because of the government. No, the reason we don't have it now is just because time has progressed, we have more luxuries. Like, we're living a lifestyle now that kings and emperors didn't have in 1890. And we didn't get that from government. We got that through relatively free markets and relatively free trade. So, thanks capitalism. Number 14, if we didn't have government, we'd all be in hovercrafts, and nobody would have cancer, and broccoli would be ice cream? Yes, I believe that's what Mises was talking about in Human Action. Number 15, unregulated markets have been tried. In the 80s and 90s, the 1880s and 1890s were the robber baron age. These regulations didn't come out of an interest in restricting liberty. What they did is came out of an interest in helping those who have been victimized by a system they couldn't fight back against. There's a fantastic book I've been reading called The Myth of the Robber Barons that I found at a local bookstore about a month ago, and it's very eye-opening as to how much better life became because of these supposed robber barons. Cornelius Vanderbilt, for instance, because that's the first chapter in the book, he broke the state of New York's imposed ferry monopoly and made a career out of outcompeting government-backed and federally funded competitors. He did this entirely through free market competition. And the reality? Dude got rich. He got filthy rich. And good for him, because guess what? The prices of steamboat transport plummeted, and for the first time, people who weren't wealthy could afford traveling by boat. The regulations that came around that time, contrary to popular myth, guaranteed the monopolizing of industries. Rothbard absolutely BTFO'd this myth in his lectures on monopolies and in his works on the Progressive Era, and I'll give you a snippet of that here. In terms of real wages, the average daily wage in all industry rose by 13% from 1865 to 1891, while the cost of living fell on average of 31% in the same period. The average daily real wages, corrected for price changes, increased 64%. Then, when we consider that average hours worked dropped from 11 to 10 hours a day in this period, we should add 10% to the average real wage. So spectacular was the expansion of products that it outstripped the increase in the money supply during this period, so that overall prices fell steadily by 2.5% a year from 1870 to 1890. And I love that he mentions that 2.5% fall for those 2 decades from 1870 to 1890. Again, exactly the time period that John Stewart is talking about being so horrible. What's great about that is because the Federal Reserve now aims for 2.5% to 3% inflation every year. So the system that the government has established, this banking cartel, they try to hit 2.5% to 3% a year. Of course, now they're failing because we're getting closer to 9%, because we're at 40-year high inflation rates because of the banking cartel imposed by the government. But that pretty much does it with the robber baron myth. This happened because of markets and competition. People still lived in harsh conditions at the time, but that isn't because of free markets. That has been the norm throughout human history. It was markets and the wealth created by them that lifted humanity out of those conditions. We completely globally reversed the poverty trend since 1890. It was something like 93 to 95% of people in 1890 lived in perpetual poverty. That has completely reversed by the year 2000, where it was less than 7% lived in perpetual poverty. Over 93% of humanity lives outside of poverty now. As someone once said, we shouldn't ask what causes poverty because poverty is the normal state of humanity. We should ask what causes prosperity because that has been the exception. And they're right. What causes prosperity is free trade and free market capitalism. Number 16, why do you think workers that worked in the mines unionize? I say let them unionize. And if it's a voluntary union that is not coercively funded, they have every right to do so. Workers have every right to unite for better conditions and higher wages if they want to. Hell, I'll go even further than that. I just finished reading Peter Kropotkin's Conquest of Bread, and for those of you who are not aware, Kropotkin was an anarcho-communist from the late 19th century. He was an advocate of communistic mutual aid systems where money is abolished and all agriculture and property, if you can call it that, is communally owned. Goods are produced by the community for the community, and yes, in a voluntary society like I'm supporting, that is totally allowed. You can set up regions where goods are communally owned and exchanged without money or anything like money, whether it's labor notes or whatever. From each according to his ability to each according to his need is totally allowed if it's voluntary. I'm convinced that it is a vastly inferior system and that it is doomed to failure, but the beauty is, I'm not your king, I am not your lord. Be free as long as you're not imposing on others and forcing them to stay. Number 17, without the government, there are no labor unions, because they would be smashed by Pinkerton agencies or people hired or even sometimes the government. Well, if we're operating off the ideas that I've repeatedly stated here and in other videos on my channel, then of course they could unionize. The only condition that has to be met is that everything is done voluntarily and peacefully. That goes for the agencies that strongly oppose their unionization as well. They have every right to oppose these unions, and the employers have every right to hire new workers if those workers agree voluntarily to the conditions and wages offered. And John even mentions in his question here, it's not really a question, it's actually just a statement, that sometimes even the government does this with the labor unions. Okay, well, if it happens in the free market, you would say, well, that's why we can't have the free market. But yet if the government does it and has done it in the past, then we don't just say, well, we got to scrap the government, do you, John? No, you say the government just needs to be fixed. We need to have more of a push to get rid of it in the government. So again, it is a inconsistency in the standard you hold between the market and government. Number 18, would the free market have desegregated restaurants in the South, or would the free market have done away with miscegenation if it had been allowed to? Would Martin Luther King have been less effective than the free market? Those laws sprung up out of a majority sense of, in that time, that blacks should not. The free market there would not have supported integrated lunch counters. Well, as you mentioned, the Jim Crow laws that segregated the South were, in fact, laws. They were government-imposed restrictions on every business and institution in those states. Even if businesses wanted to integrate, they were forbidden from integrating. It was voluntary protest in both public and private spaces that led to the civil rights movement. The change very well could have happened without the imposition of the federal government, as the culture around the violence and the hatred that was going on in the American South was showcased to the American people and the world as being unjust and vile. I'll also add that not all, or maybe even most, businesses would have integrated nearly as quickly, but without the laws imposed by the state governments, we can't know exactly how it would have worked. What I do know is that if someone owns a business, they should have the right to discriminate against anyone for any reason, including racial prejudice. Private property necessitates the right of exclusion to whomever the property owner does not want to associate with. This is a basic of property rights. Just because you don't like it doesn't mean you get to impose your will on others, or better yet, it doesn't justify empowering a violent monopoly to impose your will for you on others. Ultimately, because of government laws and institutions dehumanizing black Americans for decades till that time, we can't know how much better opportunity black men and women would have had to bridge the gap of power in those societies, and how much better off their descendants would be in terms of wealth and prosperity from being able to compete in the market of goods and prices without governmental institutional discrimination. Question number 19. Government is necessary, but must be held accountable for its decisions. Alright, by question 19, I am really left wondering if Jon Stewart knows what a question is, because half of these are just statements and bold assertions. But to answer the statement, government isn't necessary for one. But two, the idea that it is accountable for its decisions is just embarrassingly naive. I think I can close this one out with a fitting quote from the late great Murray Rothbard. And indeed, what is the state anyways but organized banditry? What is taxation but theft on a gigantic unchecked scale? What is war but mass murder on a scale impossible by private police forces? What is conscription but mass enslavement? Can anyone envision a private police force getting away with a tiny fraction of what states get away with, and do habitually, year after year, century after century? Where's the accountability for the trillions in theft the government commits against the productive sector every year? Where's the accountability for the mass murder it regularly commits? The U.S. government today, through civil asset forfeiture alone, steals more property from citizens than all private thieves do combined in the country. Where's the accountability for President Biden signing a 1994 crime bill which put more black people in chains than slavery, while his own son videos himself weighing his crack rocks? Government accountability is a myth, and you need to grow up, John.